My name is John Nichols. I'm the curator here, and we're at the Santa Paula Union Oil Museum in Santa Paula, California. It's a few blocks from the closest point to the St. Francis Dam disaster flooding here in Santa Paula. We're a little bit above the floodplain, so this building was not impacted by that. But in this room is a condensed version of the St. Francis Dam disaster exhibit that we call Dam Break: Heroes and Survivors. On this wall are panoramic photos done just after the flood, just within a week after the flood. They were commissioned by Ventura County District Attorney James Hollingsworth, and at that point, when he commissioned them, it was still thought that Ventura County was going to have to sue Los Angeles County. There might be a lawsuit. Eventually, all the damages were settled out of court, but they didn't know that at the time, so the district attorney thought the best thing to do would be to commission a Ventura photographer, Bernie Eisensee, to photograph the path of destruction. There's a little picture here of Bernie Eisensee with a couple of the sheriff's deputies, taken by another Ventura photographer, Leslie White. And this photo was taken March 20th, 1928. The panoramic photos, the camera that takes them is called a banquet camera, and it's usually used for school pictures, large groups of pictures, long, narrow, or banquets with hundreds of people. The fact that they're used for landscapes is a little unusual. It's a kind of a camera that was, the negatives were as large as the final print. They're all contact printed. And the lens is usually spring wound. You wind up a little spring, and then when you trip the shutter, the lens would move to photograph the landscape. And we've got them set up on the wall so that the furthest west is here on our left, and the furthest east, closer to the dam, is on the far right. So we have them in somewhat geographical order, left to right. This one doesn't reveal much, but it's taken in the area of Montalvo, but Bernie's Photoshop is the credit on this photo, and this particular one was taken March 16th, 1928. Flooded area at Montalvo. There's not much you can see of the flooded area, but it's interesting to see the rural Ventura of the time. This one right above it, Satacoy to Santa Paula. So as we continue east along the Santa Clara River Valley, we're starting to see the width of the devastation. It's wider and more intense, obviously, as we go east. This particular one was taken March 15th, 1928. It took these over a several-day period. Each one is from a different date. This one's March 17th. And again, the dam disaster was evening of March 12th, morning of March 13th. So all of these are within 3 or 4 days of the disaster. And there's still debris and water puddling in here. This is a panorama that shows the city of Santa Paula, and if you look closely, you can see the 12th Street Bridge knocked out. And then here we're going east of Santa Paula, March 17th, 1928, up on toward Fillmore and Piru, and the rest of the panoramics come up into the Bardsdale area, east of Bardsdale. That was a low-lying area Lots of devastation occurred there just because it was a low-lying area. The dates on these are March 17th, March 16th. So Bernie's Photoshop. Bernie was pretty busy on that week. We borrowed these from the Ventura County Flood Control District. They were on loan from the Wright Library, Friends of the Library. The library owned a set, and they remodeled and did something in their bookcases, and they didn't have room for these anymore, so they were lent to the Ventura County Flood Control District. So we eventually tracked them down and located them for this exhibit and borrowed them. This panoramic, is the flooded area at the Los Angeles-Ventura line, showing the Edison camp, March 18th. This is the area where all the Edison workers were camped out right by the riverside in that evening. I think the pocket of devastation here, about 85 workers were killed. They were all in their tents in that evening. That was a pretty intense experience, as reported in the newspaper. And then we're coming back here to Castaic, sort of leveled. Going up this canyon past Castaic, that's when we get up into San Francisco Canyon, and we'll be looking at another panoramic view of the dam site itself a little later. The photos above these panoramics are photos that we borrowed the negatives from the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, and they show the piece of the dam that was remaining and some of the chunks of the dam falling. This is the downstream face of the dam. You can see the steps going up and that piece of the dam. This next one over here is the upstream of the dam. So we're sort of behind the dam, and we have a couple of the dam under construction. And one of the dam just after its completion, before it started to leak. Okay, this is one of my favorite photographs from not necessarily documenting the flood, but it has some other interesting features that I like a lot. It's facing toward Ventura. There's not a lot of information in here about the dam, but to me it shows there's a biplane landing. So people must have been visiting the site to see the devastation. It must have been, it did attract. I've read newspaper accounts of hundreds of people a day coming into the area to see the accident, similar to what people do today when there's a fire and things. This is March 18th, and we part of the exhibit was to put out small magnifying glasses for people to encourage them to get up and really look at the details here. And for the first time, I've looked at these cars, and there's a group of 4 men standing next to this convertible, and other cars parked here. Must be people walking around looking at the devastation in this area, right west of Edison Camp. I imagine, and one of the reasons photographically that these pictures are so sharp is that they are a contact print. They're not enlarged from a negative. The negative is placed right in contact with the paper and exposed, so you get a really incredible amount of detail, which is important for the study of history. And there's a lot of things that photographs can teach us that newspaper accounts, eyewitness accounts can't. Just the tremendous amount of details that are available. These are a couple of letters that I found in a local estate, and I imagine that if these letters were found anyplace else but in Santa Paula, people wouldn't know what they were referring to. But when I saw them, I knew that they were related to the St. Francis Dam disaster. And this particular letter is from the Riverside County, California Federation of Women's Clubs, and it was addressed to the president, Mrs. Homer Cheek. She was Hazel Cheek. My dear Mrs. Cheek, at our county board meeting a few days ago, we stood for a few moments with bowed heads in silent tribute to those who lost their lives and those who lost loved ones in the great disaster which visited your section of our Southland. The board instructed me to write your county federation, extending the sympathy of the women of Riverside County and assuring you that we should be glad to be of any assistance possible. Most sincerely yours, Bernice Huff. And next to it, there's another one similar from the Executive Board of the California Federation of Women's Clubs on their letterhead. So people from throughout the state were responding to this disaster, sending relief, sending supplies, and then sending condolences. We put a lot of snapshots in the exhibit cases to tell the story as only snapshots can. They're not real, some of these aren't really snapshots, they're commercial photography. They're signed by Harding, SP. I used to live across the street from a man named George Harding, and I asked him, is there any relationship to you? And he said, no, this is some other Harding. So I don't know much about this photographer, but his work turns up a lot in the photos. The little booklet up here, St. Francis Dam disaster, that's similar to maybe a People magazine special that would come out on Princess Di or any other kind of a disaster. This came out priced 35 cents, and had information. It was a souvenir booklet, if you can call it a booklet about a disaster, a souvenir. This is a photograph of William Mulholland that we borrowed from the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. They have a small museum at one of their power stations, and they were nice enough to lend us this portrait of the chief. That's what people who worked with him called him. This is a photograph album that we put on display. It was carefully unbound. Each leaves of this album were unbound so we could put it back together after the exhibit. I've seen about 3 examples of this album, the same album. It was done by a commercial photographer or a good amateur, somebody that did it commercially, and they wrote in red pencil on the black pages of the album, so it's a little difficult to decipher the signature of the photographer. It's by, and then it gets all crumpled, and all the ones I've seen, I've not been able to identify who the photographer was, except that it's St. Francis Dam disaster, March 13th, 1928. And the pages each had mounted photographs with enlarged, and on the facing page of each photograph were these inscriptions, which I've copied over here on black pieces of map board to sort of replicate what the photo album looked like. So these photos each have captions from upriver, Santa Paula. Now, there were from about 3 of these albums, some of the photographs weren't identified in some of the albums, and that they were identified in others. So from looking at the 3 different albums, I was able to get a caption for each of the photographs, and we eventually got some complete captions. And I imagine, from a commercial photographer's point of view, this would be a way to cash in on the disaster, to supply the public's need for some photographs of the disaster. These don't survive in large numbers, but they were made up one at a time afterwards and sold locally. And they're a really interesting way to get information in the days before movies were widely available. There weren't a lot of people with movie cameras going out. There were even fewer people with snapshot cameras. At 1928, it just wasn't the norm for every family to have lots of cameras. So what photographs we do have are valuable and not easily found. So we're lucky to have this particular album that surveys mostly the devastation in Santa Paula and Fillmore and Bardsdale. It comes up it goes a little bit into occasionally in the Castaic area. And here's a photograph of a lot of the cars left behind by the Edison worker and some of the area out in Castaic. But it doesn't cover the entire 54 miles of the path of destruction as do Bernie Eisensee's panoramic photos. They weren't intended to be a complete documentary. They were more, I imagine, to be sold in the urban areas affected. Who knows how many of these were sold outside of the area or how many were made. I mean, it's impossible to determine. And in this corner, we visited the Department of Water and Power, and they were really helpful, the people at the Department of Water and Power, in providing us with as much information as we needed. These are color photographs of pages from the logbook of Powerhouse Number 1. Powerhouse Number 2 was wiped out by the disaster, but Powerhouse Number 1 was upstream. And the 2 workers that evening, Ray Sylvie and H.R. Tate, they went on duty at about 11 p.m. on March 12th. And we've got the minute by minute 11, Sylvie Tate on, Sinclair, somebody Brunger off. And then there are notes coming on, what happened at 11:05, 11:10, 11:23. Finally, at 11:57 and a half, heavy bump, bus voltage to 90. And I don't know what any of that means, but it's in the people that know about running a power plant, that was the indication that something was wrong. And then a new page starts at 12 o'clock. By 12, and we've identified the key points by these little red lines. By 12:02, Powerhouse Number 2 is washed away, and that's the note is cryptic. Station black, voltage to 0, full-scale amps on all units, 100% ground. 100% ground is disaster in their terms. But Powerhouse Number 2 is washed away. The line connecting the plants had short-circuited with electricity flowing to grounded path. Then at 12:12, the west line is tested. It shows 100% short circuit in the ground. And then again at 12:15 they tested it with the same results. At 12:21 Edison reports a heavy bump when powerhouse number 1 tries testing the lines. So they're up there, upstream, not knowing what's going on. And eventually, at 12:25, the operators are apparently suspicious of major problems, probably because of no communication with powerhouse number 2. At 1:09, Oscar Spainhauer, chief operator of powerhouse number 1, reports that the St. Francis Dam's gone out. And you can refer to Charles Outland's Man-Made Disaster, and he, in his book, recounts minute-by-minute account of all the events. This is just what was happening at powerhouse number 1. These are photocopies of claims and letters from the estate of Jake Kleiman, deceased, who was carried away and drowned in the flood following the collapse of the St. Francis Dam disaster. These papers came from his niece, I think Miss Anna Marie Volker, administratrix of his estate. It's interesting that for every person who died, the claims forms had to be filled out. Date of accident, place of accident, St. Francis Dam, City of Los Angeles. This is a claimant's statement. Filling out forms for to get restitution. The value of his agricultural crops. This is what I find most interesting. Claims for damage. The clothing, every one dark blue suit, $35. One heavy overcoat, $30. 1 dozen work socks, $6. Other personal property, 1926 Dodge sedan, $800. 1 watch, $25. So there was, what had to be done was every item, the dining room, the bedrooms, 3 beds, the kitchen, 1 kitchen table, 6 chairs, everything's listed here, total assets, so that restitution could be paid. And then throughout this book, you'll see letters back and forth to the bank saying, well, how much did he have in the bank? What was his estate? How do we prove this? How do we prove he owned these cars? Pretty fascinating just to see the amount of letters that had to go back and forth and the amount of work that had to be done for just one person, and you multiply that times all the people that died and all that. It's a tremendous undertaking to get the claims and restitutions going. We were lucky enough to find an engineer who'd been studying the St. Francis Dam for all his life, and he's put together several drawings, 2 of which are here. And one of the drawings is the St. Francis Dam as built. And we can show some of where the cracks occurred, a little bit some of the elevations and the capacity of the reservoir, all kinds of interesting technical details, cross-section of the dam. The major cracks. This will all have to be explained by Clarence technically. But he's also gone into how the dam should have been built. A Monday morning quarterback design after 70 years. It's fascinating to me that after 70 years, this dam is still being studied intensely by geologists and engineers, and new interpretations are constantly emerging as people look at it more closely or apply 3D modeling, computer simulations, all those things. And other geologists that is studied this is Steve Mulqueen from Ventura. And this is another Bernie Eisensee panoramic of the dam, and we've put together acetate overlay over the photograph so that we could show a few of the details of the dam. And here we are with the piece of the dam that's remaining, and we're upstream. All this area off to the left is where the water would have been after it was drained out. And from a geologist's point of view, this east section is schist, chunks of broken concrete, schist, and then we're getting into, on the other side of this fault that occurs right here, is Sespe conglomerate. And those two types of rocks coming together were partly responsible for the failure of the dam. Where we can see the area of the landslide that occurred in back of the dam, precipitating the failure. In this case, we've put several more snapshots interspersed with newspaper accounts that we photocopied. The day-to-day newspaper accounts were fascinating. The conditions kept changing day to day. The body count kept increasing. The number of homes, the death list was growing. At about that time, people would take off with their snapshot camera and photograph the devastation. It would be just a natural attraction. So, and then later, some of them were put together and assembled into albums, typical black pages with black mounting corners. And in some cases, as is often the case, people would mix in a combination of commercial photographs with their own amateur photographs. The advantage of the snapshot in the study of history is that the person didn't have any commercial intent, so the snapshot taker would be looking at things that we might not have gotten a commercial photographer to look at twice because it had no commercial potential. So therefore we get features of the aftermath that are only revealed by some snapshots. Just chicken pens collapsed, piles of lumber, cars and debris. It's a fascinating visual record. In this case, there's also, mixed in among the snapshots, are some of the books that have been printed on the topic. These particular snapshots were just presented to me in a white envelope. They were never mounted in a snapshot album. Maybe that seemed a little bit too gruesome for the person who took the snapshots to actually mount them in an album. That would have been maybe not something that you would want to sit in your parlor and look through. But they do exist, and they were saved, and they're mostly from the devastation around Santa Paula. The books are about the St. Francis Dam disaster by Charles Outland, Man-Made Disaster. That's sort of the first and the key book on this topic, written in 1963. Since then, a lot of geologists have issued reports on their theories on the failure of the dam. And most recently, the Ventura County Museum published a book by J. David Rogers, The St. Francis Dam Disaster Revisited. It's ironic that nothing is currently in print about the St. Francis Dam disaster. I guess this little field trip guidebook is available, but this one is from April 3rd through 10th, 1998. I've got to buy this. This is one I don't have in my collection. We'll go on to that. Part of our intention as curators was to make this exhibit somewhat interactive. So we put out a binder with paper in it and called for people's recollections and opinions. And please add your words to this book. And I'm really enjoying going back and reading people's reaction to the exhibit and their personal reminiscences. We're getting a lot of interesting survivors and relatives of survivors who writing their recollections. This particular one, my grandpa, Moises Lavario, survived the flood and worked washing with hot water the crinkled up, muddy dead bodies of the persons that died so that their loved ones would be able to recognize them and not see them in the state they were found. This exhibit helped me understand what my grandpa saw and remembered so sadly. He was 20 years old then. He's 89 now. Thank you. Fabian Mauricio, age 12. Now, that was great. That gives me a lot of good feelings to be able to do that for a 12-year-old, to get them to appreciate the experiences of their grandparent. This portion of the exhibit has been assembled by the Santa Paula Historical Society, and they went out to the local cemetery and, with the permission of the family, did a rubbing of this tombstone. And it's in Spanish, but it's translated up here in memoriam. In this tomb are buried the mortal remains of Mrs. Mary Perez, 48 years of age, and her daughters and grandson, Antonio Perez, 24 years of age, Jesus Perez, 22 years of age, and Andres Perez, 7 years of age, who died in the tragic flood of March 13th, 1928. To their memory, this monument is dedicated by Racino Perez and Sebastiano Perez. It really shows that Latino families were heavily impacted by this flood, and also entire families were often wiped out. Here's a headline from the Santa Paula Chronicle: thousands attend funeral here, with so many, and this is March 19th. The funeral services were Monday, March 19th at 2 p.m. at the Santa Paula Cemetery. The mass burial of all the people at once is a pretty chilling experience. 7 truckloads of flowers made into wreaths by 300 local women were delivered at the cemetery early this afternoon and draped upon 14 caskets of victims of the flood, which were interred. 2,500 Santa Paulans gathered in a semicircle about the graves, and the story continues. Part of their exhibit was to take headlines: March 17th, 250 to 275 dead. Day by day, the death toll kept mounting in the front pages of the newspaper until they could finally estimate roughly how many had died. Where are we? March 16th. And we're skipping around in time, but unofficial death list at 275. Afterwards, the crews came in to clean up the debris almost immediately. According to the Santa Paula Chronicle, March 16th, with 100 steam shovels to dig the holes and 35 tractors to pull the animals from place to place. Many of those lying on the open land were expected to be covered today. They were just dead animals all over the place, piles of debris. This photo shows some workers pulling a dead body out of the branches, out of the piles of debris, which would have been a combination of citrus trees and mud and fences and debris. One story I remember reading was, they're pulling bodies out of the debris, and there are also nests of rattlesnakes in some of the debris. I mean, not enough to actually have to deal with dead bodies, you have to deal with snakes. And then they're loading them up onto flatbed trucks and taking them to makeshift mortuaries. And then another job of some of the people would have been to wash the bodies, as was told by the story in the book, that by the person that wrote about their grandfather. And then this continues on with their exhibit of photographs of some of the aftermath, which we can talk about. But on a pedestal, here we have a piece of the St. Francis Dam. This is flat surface is one of the steps from the face of the dam, and we can see the huge chunks of rock that were mixed in with the cement to form this. And it looks like I can feel this piece of what I assume to be schist, sort of slippery already, which is part of the problem. Over here, this particular piece of furniture, which is just sort of unusual as a desk. Jeanette Romney, who's no longer living, but she was one of the oral history interviews that told a story about this, and she's quoted as saying, "I do remember getting up and looking out from our sleeping porch, and I could look at the walnut orchard down below us, and there was a piano sitting in the orchard. Later, Perry Granger told me that it was their piano sitting in the orchard, and that his mother had a desk made out of some of the pieces from that piano. And this is the desk. Piano wood. The piano would have been washed away from their home downstream and wrecked as a piano, but they saved the wood and made it into that desk. What a interesting relic. We put the Historical Society put some costumes up here of Salvation Army workers and some of the things that they would have, blankets and pillows that would have arrived shortly after. According to Norris Proctor, the Salvation Army came in with lots of beds and so forth and set up a dormitory in the old Walnut House. Here's a photograph of Louise Gipe, night operator. And one of the ways that people were warned about the disaster was by phone. And these women, particularly Louise, sat at the switchboard and continued to call people and warn them. And at the time, she didn't know that she knew the flood was coming, but she didn't know that it wouldn't be washing her away. But they stayed at their job, and they were called the Hello Girls. The Hello Girls being the nickname of the switchboard operators, and they stick to job to warn. And many lives were saved because of the heroism of the telephone girls in the Santa Paula telephone office at Fillmore. One of the reasons we named this exhibit Dam Break, Heroes and Survivors is because we wanted to honor the memory of the people who made heroic actions as well as honor the dead survivors. In the display case, there's some debris and artifacts that were picked up, excavated downstream. And these are mostly on loan from the Department of Water and Power. Artifacts from the San Francisco Power Plant number 2 residents that lived there between 1920 and 28. And parts of a wooden box and parts of the railing, actual parts of the railing of the St. Francis Dam. Salvation Army and Red Cross, so we have a couple of Red Cross uniforms showing their contribution to helping the people during the aftermath of the dam disaster. The title of this exhibit was Dam Break, Heroes and Survivors at the Santa Paula Union Oil Museum. Our explanatory text on the back of this handout may help put the disaster in perspective. Minutes before midnight on the chilly evening of March 12th, 1928, the St. Francis Dam failed. The dam's 200-foot-high concrete wall crumpled and collapsed, sending billions of gallons of raging floodwaters down San Francisco Canyon, about 5 miles northeast of what is now Magic Mountain. The avalanche of water swept 54 miles down the Santa Clara River Valley to the sea. An exact death toll was never arrived at, but more than 450 people perished in the disaster. The St. Francis Dam disaster is second only to the San Francisco earthquake and fire of 1906 in the history of California disasters. Aside from the similarity in names and the comparable death tolls, the disasters had little in common. The San Francisco earthquake is referred to as an act of God, while the St. Francis Dam disaster can be attributed to human error. It was the greatest American civil engineering failure of the 20th century.